Thank you.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you everybody again for being here. So what I'll do is I'll just present a paper for about 30 minutes or so, and then at the end I will walk you through a series of images that relate to some of the matters that I bring up in the talk. So, as you know, we're here to discuss the kind of consequences of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre that occurred between May 30 and June 1 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Greenwood district, which is an all-Black district. And the interesting thing is that it starts with this encounter between a Black shoe shine named Dick Rowland and a white elevator operator named Sarah Page. And so there's not much known about the encounter between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page in that elevator at the Drexel building on May 30, 1921. As the story goes, Dick Rowland, a Black teenage shoe shine, working in a white-owned shine parlor in downtown Tulsa, crossed the street to use a colored-only restroom on the top floor of the Drexel building. In the Drexel, the elevators were typically operated by white women, one of whom was a 17-year-old Sarah Page. What happened next is unclear. Not only is it unclear, but it has also been the subject of numerous accounts and forms of speculation. The most accepted narrative is that Rowland tripped on the threshold of the elevator while entering, causing him to stumble into Page or step onto her foot. What isn't speculation is that Page screamed and Rowland ran. From that point, a building clerk called the police and made the initial claim of Rowland's assault on Page. Page initially told the police that Rowland had only startled her and did not wish to press charges, evidenced by the fact that they initially did not seek Rowland's arrest. However, the story would develop, and Rowland was arrested at his home the following day and taken to the city jail. It appeared as if the police sought to conduct an unbiased investigation into the matter from all reported accounts, even dispatching white and Black officers to arrest Rowland. The narrative of the incident, though, would be all but unbiased. The morning of Rowland's arrest, the Tulsa Tribune printed the article titled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." With this article and another titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight," the white population of Tulsa began to stir, agitated by the notion of this assault. Threats on Rowland's life began to circulate, instigated entirely by these media accounts. As a result, the police commissioner, J.M. Atkinson, considered taking Rowland out of town for his protection, but settled on moving him to the county jail, which he thought to be sufficiently secure. Such consideration for Rowland's safety proved prudent, as a white mob soon gathered to lynch him. So mob violence and vigilantism had been common forms of extra-legal white justice in Oklahoma. However, it was not a feature of Tulsa's history of white violence in response to its Black population. Evan Woodson explains that due to a combination of vigilance on the part of the Black community, the integrity of its law enforcement, and good fortune, Tulsa had mostly avoided instances of racial violence throughout the first 13 years of its statehood, which began in 1907. However, as Charles Henry has noted, the lynching of a white man, Roy Belton, the summer prior, had given enough reason to be concerned. Belton had taken part in a taxi robbery, killing the driver. Belton was taken from the courthouse and hanged outside of town. The sheriff offered little in the way of resistance and took the view that Belton's hanging would deter crime. One would be remiss in assuming Rowland would avoid a similar fate. And so the Black community did worry. The Tribune had done its job. There was an established practice, call it a habit even, of the white papers in Tulsa instigating some form or another of mob vigilantism, stoking political anxiety and white anger. Within 3 hours of the Rowland story hitting newsstands, a crowd of hundreds of angry whites had gathered at the courthouse where the police were holding Rowland in the jail on the top floor. By the evening, the numbers doubled, all demanding a lynching. In response to the growing crowd, Rowland and the officers watching him were ordered by Sheriff Willard McCullough to barricade themselves inside the jail. This precaution seemed sufficient to the sheriff, who had already begun turning away whites entering the courthouse to prevent the attempted lynching. McCullough, while ordering the dispersal of the white crowd, failed to enforce it unsurprisingly. The crowd remained. By this time, news began to circulate in all Black Greenwood, the district where Roland lived. So news about the crowd gathered at the courthouse spread in the community, with some accounts stating that they had entered the courthouse. As a result, multiple separate efforts in the Black community of Greenwood organized a counter-gathering of Black Tulsans, Black Cherokee freedmen, many of them World War I veterans, to defend against the white threat to Roland. This group, which was only around 30 to 40 strong, was encouraged by the police to leave unless their presence gave rise to a riot. Having been given a guarantee of Roland's safety, the gathering of Black Tulsans dispersed, as the white crowd grew to upwards of 2,000. This white crowd, which could by then only be considered a mob, became a more significant threat, having attempted to steal weapons and ammunition from the National Guard armory. What happened next, one might say, was inevitable. As a dispersed group of Black Tulsans returned to Greenwood, the white mob followed them. But what followed with them was not a disorganized rage or impromptu display of violence, but instead a calculated assault on Greenwood. That violence began with the whites' careful armament in preparation for what newspapers like the New York Times described post-riot as a siege on Tulsa's Negro quarters. Greenwood's residents fought to protect their neighborhood. Although it had enjoyed a reputation as a Negro or Black Wall Street, Greenwood was by no means universally affluent. However, all who called Greenwood home had enjoyed access to public life made mainly on their terms and crafted in their image through robust commercial activity that was built on secondary access to the larger economy in Tulsa, driven by the oil industry and maintained by segregation's containment of Black capital in Black neighborhoods. Whether it was going to the Dreamland Theater or attending service at the well-appointed historic Vernon AME or Mount Zion Baptist churches, or being proud of the advanced curriculum at the local Booker T. Washington High School, or even the more ordinary delight of just being seen walking down Greenwood Avenue with its shops and parlors, it was all worth defending. Many were caught off guard by the attack on their community. Perhaps confusion, doubt, and even disbelief slowed their response. Some fled, presaging the refugeeism to come in the following weeks. In one way or another, white violence stalked this Black community, which was not involved with the matter surrounding Dick Rowland and Sarah Page on the preceding day. This period was an ominous moment of liminality for the city between what Greenwood was before the Rowland Page incident and what it would become thereafter. Whatever that might be would be determined by a trial by fire. Indeed, those first fires were started around 1 a.m., beginning at the intersection of Archer Street and Boston Avenue. This assault was at the very border of Greenwood. Although the fire department attempted to quell the growing blazes, the white mob, numbered at about 500, prohibited their access. The violence of the machine gun fire would add to the inferno, contributing to Greenwood's assault. Gunshots fired and returned by both sides began at the geographic boundary between Black and white Tulsa. Fighting along the Frisco railroad tracks represented a battle line where the city's soul and the very life of its residents were contested. Black Tulsans defended Greenwood's border for several hours until its ultimate breach at 6 a.m. and the full invasion of Greenwood ensued. Already outnumbered, early estimates indicated that thousands of whites had by then joined the assault. The police detainment of Black residents further impeded Greenwood's ability to defend itself. Regardless of whether they were armed, Black Tulsans were pulled off the streets and from their homes by the police, the National Guard, and by deputized whites, and assaulted and imprisoned by the dozens. Detained Black Tulsans were interned at the Convention Hall, McNulty Baseball Park, and the fairgrounds. These camps at one point held over 6,000 Tulsans, now formally recognized as refugees, which, given both the warlike experience as well as their dispossession, was an apt characterization. Furthermore, to be released from the camps, detainees had to be claimed by white acquaintances, with most internees remanded into the custody of their employers. Historian James Hirsch places the number of detained Black Tulsans at about 60 to 80% of the total Black population in the city. He further estimates that up to 4,000 left the city, at least for some time, citing the hundreds of one-way tickets bought with destinations on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts and the respective epicenters of San Francisco and New York. These Tulsans were fleeing violence and therefore were pursuing a place of refuge. We should also assume, right, that these distances, right, were necessarily a part of the broad circuit of African-American life that follows, in fact, the long process of migration in seeking of refuge following the abolition of enslavement in this country and the multiple migrations that African-Americans were required to seek in order to pursue a better life. So what we see is that there are a remarkable, capturing of these events by postcard photographs, which I'll show you some later, such as the one titled "Running the Negro Out of Tulsa," which illustrates or demonstrates how many African Americans who fled the violence and the aftermath of the violence in Tulsa had to literally walk to nearby towns. But as Scott Ellsworth argues, all of these actions, needless to say, rendered the defense of Black property impossible. So the ability to contain and detain Black Tulsans, the deputization of white citizens to increase the surveillance and the policing and the arrest of Black Tulsans, and the literal burning of their neighborhoods, their material resources, right? All of these played into the inability to maintain self-defense in the city. In general, police actions played right into the hands of the white rioters who were looting and burning Greenwood. The internment process did not occur without Black opposition, but again, Black Tulsans were simply outnumbered. Meanwhile, the burning and looting of Greenwood advanced. Alongside the arson and theft was murder. The mob killed many of Greenwood's residents, protecting their property, even after surrendering to deputized whites. In the air, and notably in the hearts of the white terrorists, was an outright lust for racial violence and hatred for Black people. That hateful violence contravened even the most racist codes of Jim Crow and could express itself fully in the mob's actions. A statement from Adjutant General Charles J. Barrett in the New York Times on June 3, 1921, in the wake of the violence, emphasizes the point. 25,000 whites, he writes, armed to the teeth, were raging the city in utter and ruthless defiance of every concept of law and righteousness. Motor cars bristling with guns swept through your city, their occupants firing at will. Utter and ruthless defiance, he says. And there was neither law, reason, nor recourse to which Black Tulsans could turn for safety in this moment of the elated and blind violence that occurred during the suspension of lawful racism. Black Tulsans endured white predatory mobs who patrolled white neighborhoods seeking to capture any Black person they could find. Whites dragged Black Tulsans behind vehicles as a visceral warning of the consequence of being discovered and captured. If the accounts are to be believed, the sheer horror of the ground assault was exacerbated to an unimaginable degree by dynamite bombs dropped from airplanes, striking terror and devastation in the Black community's heart. The massacre was the result of an array of complicit acts and acts of many guilty parties. The Tulsa Tribune instigated the furor. The police fueled the violence that destroyed Greenwood and led to the murder and expulsion of its residents by initially failing to disperse the white mob asking for Rowland's lynching, by deputizing white Tulsans, and their provisioning of weapons. This violence triggered the National Guard, who arrested and detained those who remained alive and in place. Those deputized predatory whites released the inner hatred that drove the long tradition of white imperial violence. This collection of actors and the assortment of their actions together comprise this imperial violence's singular thrust, which is destruction. The violence was simultaneously destructive as well as constructive. Over those 2 days, the violence facilitated the resumption of a particular order of the world. Indeed, these acts recalibrated Tulsa's racial, economic, and political relations. The recalibration did not simply return white Tulsa to the status quo, but instead expanded the reach and impact of white control over the entire city. So the violence of the massacre that would maintain order in Tulsa would be followed by a violence that looked different but yielded the same effect. This violence was an arresting containment of Black life in the city that was directly committed to preventing Greenwood's reestablishment. On June 4th, just days after the massacre, the Tulsa Tribune, which ran the Nab Negro article that stoked the violence that led to the massacre, published an editorial, "It must not be again," imploring the city to not allow Greenwood's rebuilding, and much less its revival. They wrote, Such a district as the old nigger town must never be allowed in Tulsa again. And this was the first line in the editorial. There was a moment where it seemed that Tulsa would resist the vitriolic admonitions of the publication's racism. The Public Welfare Board, a group of sympathetic private citizens, moved to assist with Greenwood's rebuilding. However, the mayor disbanded the board in favor of what was called the Reconstruction Committee and the Real Estate Commission, which sought to convert Greenwood into a white industrial zone. This plan would bolster industry in Tulsa, they argued, and create a commercial and geographic partition between the races. As stated in an article on the plan in the Tulsa Tribune, in the wake of the massacre, the two races being divided by an industrial section, they wrote, draw more distinctive lines between them and thereby eliminate the intermingling of the lower elements of the two races, which in our opinion is the root of the evil which should not exist. The city did what it could to obstruct Greenwood's redevelopment, at least for the benefit of its Black residents. In total, Greenwood suffered an estimated $1.8 million worth at the time of property damage, or what is the equivalent today of about $26 million, for which insurance companies declined compensation due to a riot clause in many property policies. This clause is believed to have led the massacre being named a riot in the first place, a practice which held until 2017, when a race massacre commission in Tulsa was formed to renew attention and activism around the historical event. Additionally, claimants needed to prove negligence on either the part of the city or the state in protecting their property, which is effectively impossible. Furthermore, the city created new ordinances, ironically requiring the construction of new buildings with fireproof materials. The requirement served as a financial deterrent to Black Tulsans' rebuilding efforts. Many white developers and other white Tulsans sought to take advantage and openly preyed upon struggling Greenwood residents in a practice that is all too recognizable in today's gentrification. Several Black lawyers, including the firms of Spears, Franklin, and Chappell, which formed in response to the riot, defended the property of many of Greenwood's residents, thwarting the racist industrialization project. Having overcome the commercial and legal obstruction and the predation of white developers, Greenwood's residents marshaled their long-established industriousness and mobilized their own recovery effort. Joining the lawyers, Greenwood's entrepreneurs and churches formed the foundation of Black Tulsa's revival. Their material resources, knowledge, and skills were matched by their will and resolve to rebuild. By the 1930s, after the urging and support of civic and economic leaders who formed the Greenwood Chamber of Commerce during the decade, Greenwood returned as an active hub of Black social and economic life. Black Wall Street fared better than Wall Street following the Great Depression, in fact, due to segregation's closed economic circuits that existed in Greenwood, which limited their exposure to the broader shocks to the economic system. Greenwood was made possible by the economic opportunities provided at the turn of the century by the burgeoning oil industry, which followed on from land availability just before it. As the state of Oklahoma was formed and soon after adopted segregationist codes, Tulsa's Black settlers and their early wealth and general earning power provided for their community's economic prosperity. However, it was possible but also because of segregation. The isolation of segregation helped make Greenwood socially and economically productive. However, the end of segregation in the city during the 1960s meant an end to the restrictions that had once simultaneously limited and concentrated the Black dollar in Tulsa, which white businesses began to actively solicit. While promising greater rights to its Black residents, integration sounded the death knell in many ways for the once thriving Greenwood commercial district because it came alongside a new form of isolation through the pernicious process of urban renewal, which would bring lasting damage to the neighborhood. But despite rebuilding following the 1921 massacre and what were the peak years of the 1940s and 1950s provided by war-induced industrial opportunities, Greenwood experienced a secondary destruction by government through urban renewal and the construction of the I-244 expressway. Indeed, the incident of 1921 was acute and exceptional when compared to the process that got underway during the 1950s and 1960s. This process is formally called municipal disinvestment and is best understood as the root of Black underdevelopment, or rather anti-development policies, such as the much maligned practice or founded in the much maligned practice of redlining. So going back to this issue of redlining, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, established in 1933 as part of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, began a city survey program to assess real estate and neighborhood conditions by drawing data from mortgage lenders and real estate developers. The result was a series of now iconic residential security maps that presented a polychrome of poverty and prosperity with the four graded color categories of green, blue, yellow, and red, respectively indicating best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. As the map served to signal lending risk, the centrality of housing and mortgage policy to the New Deal and to post-war development meant that being redlined would render those communities unworthy and thereby incapable of accessing capital generationally, deepening and geographically widening the wealth gap. Polk would determine that 35% of Tulsa was hazardous, unsurprisingly including the Black district of Greenwood and the growing Black neighborhoods that had grown north of the district, which would later become the predominant Black space of Tulsa, known as North Tulsa. If one looks at the Polk map of Tulsa today, the vestiges of that early designation can be easily witnessed in the contemporary geographies of Black impoverishment. So urban renewal followed redlining by building upon and exploiting the narrative of ruin and blight that the redline designation of neighborhood hazard communicated. The circular thinking that these communities were incapable of developing their neighborhoods justified local municipal and federal investment in their development, from the maintenance of infrastructure to the provision of services, thus rendering the neighborhood structurally underdeveloped. Even where these circumstances didn't fully present themselves, the power of the narrative was enough to have these neighborhoods rendered as blighted and in need of redevelopment. Through property condemnation, eminent domain, and various relocation policies, Greenwood's families and businesses were further dispersed in the 1960s through urban renewal. The federally financed effort tried to rehabilitate blighted areas by condemning property, paying occupants to move, and redeveloping the land. It achieved its first two goals, but most of the Blacks who moved never returned, and the promise of redevelopment proved hollow. In time, Black Tulsans would call urban renewal what has been now popularly noted as urban removal. Greenwood became unexceptional in the most devastating, banal way as a result. Urban renewal took the form of the development of highways that bisected Greenwood, which, like redlining, would serve to all but cement what would become North Tulsa's demise. Eminent domain and the condemning of property facilitated the construction of the highways, which were federally subsidized up to 90%. These highways, particularly Highway 244, led to another period of displacement. The sense of community and, importantly, its geographic makeup was further impacted by the creation of the highway, that splitting directly through the community, made it difficult to navigate the neighborhoods on the usual terms by which people circulated. The highway construction project for Greenwood, like in Black neighborhoods across the country, did anything but that which they claimed, save for advance the white-run municipal government's local development ambitions and the federal vision of post-war American renewal. Urban low-income Black people and the geographies they inhabited were the literal grounds for American capitalist development and expansion. And in the process, they once again were unmoored through destruction. Greenwood, once alive, active, itself the result of another kind of renewal, that of the resilient spirit and collective capital of the community, had largely dispersed. The abandonment left the space of Greenwood, once inhabited, now mainly dead, cast into the shadow of the freeway. And nearly 2,000 Black neighborhoods shared the fate of Greenwood between the 1940s and the 1970s. Slum clearance, urban renewal, and interstate highway projects became the shorthand for a particular form of intentional violence. As historian N.D.B. Connolly has argued, the Jim Crow era development required an awful lot of violence. As he explains it, white authorities charged with building, and in this instance rebuilding, city infrastructure relied on seemingly exceptional shows of white power, such as lynching or forced conscription. Violence helped hold in place the daily racial indignities upon which American capitalism and its many forms of segregation stood. The violence of urban renewal was different in form, but familiar in its consequence. As lynch law from the 1910s and 1920s then gave way to more benign tools of segregation, including racist zoning practices and promiscuous uses of eminent domain. Connolly suggests that while white supremacy's more ancient expressions were never far away, of course, white violence often preceded and precipitated state action, and it was the foreseeable consequence of state inaction. So as North Tulsa now, the Black community faces the slow consequence of what was the violence of urban renewal, and that which it wrought, which was neglect. Connolly writes that if laws under slavery made Black people disposable, then what he calls the institutional of racial apartheid, that was Jim Crow urban renewal, made Black people negligible. Through neglect and marginalization, dispossession and disqualification, the presence of these citational forms of what we might think of as order shows that we must look beyond the spectacular for the ways that violence operates. Deborah Thomas argues that instead, we should pay attention to the repertoires of spectacular violence, which are techniques of performance that have been developed over time and which make violence available in various ways. Drawing on performance studies scholar Diana Taylor's notions of repertoire as a constant state of againness, Thomas's argument finds utility in how repertoire differs from that of archive by functioning as an ongoing process of building from the past to the present. For her purposes, meaning Thomas's purposes of examining how the violence of slavery as repertoire helps to articulate violence in general, Thomas shows us how repertoire provides a way for us to imagine continuity in more complex terms, how spectacular violence itself is incorporated within and reproduced through the processes of everyday life. And so perhaps most directly relevant to the history of the race massacre, Thomas writes that violence truly functions as no single riot, no massacre, no extremely violent event that appeared as an aberration from everyday life, no one occurrence that resulted in a new reckoning of time, dividing that which happened before the event from that which happened after, but instead as a series of events that provoke ever-increasing levels of shock and disbelief that nevertheless are quickly enfolded into the realm of imaginable possibilities. So spectacular violence cannot just disappear from the repertoires of rule, but that instead they continue to exist as potential resources for the display of power. What we see is a repertoire of violence as it exists in Tulsa is that it exists through how both the spectacular and the ordinary violence of the state is continuously exercised against the Black community. From mob violence, lynching, and the insidious destruction of urban renewal, each has a performance quality of againness that is demonstrated by the continued marginalization of Black Tulsans. Their poverty serves as a peculiar archive of violence. Nearly a century after the massacre, this againness is present in the ethical and material afterlives of violence that make up the condition of contemporary Black life in Tulsa and in North Tulsa specifically. The scars of structural impoverishment mark its geography. These scars are due to the city's and state's historical reluctance to aid in the rebuilding of Greenwood in the wake of the massacre, and its intentional depreciation and exploitation through a regime of underdevelopment thereafter. What has replaced the mostly self-determined and self-reliant past of Tulsa's Black community today is instead an austere public service and a devastating lack of commercial life. The community faces chronic difficulties in accessing necessary goods. There is an absence of grocery store services. Public transportation is irregular when it's available. Overall opportunities are mainly provided by a matrix of state agencies, churches, and nonprofit organizations. All programs which typically fail as a catalyst of mobility and instead, unwittingly perhaps, sustain the effects of community underdevelopment, which we understand was initiated by the destructive violence of 1921, but reproduced through the more mundane violence of urban renewal and the poverty that it would induce. Thus, if the 2 days of the massacre was the raising of the Black city, then the slow process of dispossession that followed had been the salting of the earth. Its inheritance is identified in the social and economic instability, restriction, and arrest of the North Tulsa community. And thus, to close, we can read the pervasive poverty in Black communities as a cascading of violence, perhaps not as exceptional in its narrative as the massacre, but no less impactful. Thank you. Right, so thank you for your patience with that. What I want to do quickly is to go through some of the images, and then we can have a discussion thereafter. All right. Okay, so share screen. right. So everybody seeing that? That's a thumbs up, Sarah Jane. Yeah. Okay, great. So what we have here is an image following the race massacre of the devastation meted against this community of Greenwood. Okay. Here we have an image of Black Tulsans, Greenwood residents being marched to the detention centers. Here is a couple of examples. Here are a couple of examples of some of the postcards that were circulated following the massacre, depicting the destruction of the massacre. So the one on the left says, trucks being used to gather colored victims during Tulsa's race riot, dated 6/1/21. On the right, it says, all that was left of his home after the Tulsa race riot, dated 6/1/21. Here we have another pairing of postcards. The left says, captured Negroes on way to Convention Hall during Tulsa race riot. And on the right, sadly, we have Negroes slain in Tulsa race riot. Here is a picture of B.C. Franklin as part of the firm of Franklin Spears and Chappelle that worked to help secure Greenwood's property following the massacre, when the city was trying to, following the violence of the 2 days, trying to take hold of the property for the development of an industrial zone. Here we have the detained Tulsans being brought into the actual, this is the baseball park, McNulty Baseball Park. And so here's a quick map, right, of some of the events of the day. Here's where we have the kind of, a map of where we have the Greenwood district up to the top. Are you seeing that little blue dot? Is it working? Okay, good. Thank you. I'm trying. I'm just trying. So I won't go through everything, but what you have here is basically a map representing all of the key points of Black life in Greenwood, and some of the locations that were pertinent to the events of the race massacre. So here in the green area is the Greenwood district. And there you have Booker T. Washington High School at number 11. You have Mount Zion Church, number 10, number 8. You have the famous Stratford Hotel. You have the Tulsa Star paper, and you have the Gurley Hotel at number 9, 7 and 9 respectively. And so what you had was a complete devastation of these areas. And the Stratford and Gurley were basically what we can consider the two founders of the Greenwood district. They were the two African-American entrepreneurs who were able to acquire about 40 acres of land in Tulsa, purchased by Creek Freedman. And that began the city in 1906. So here we have a whole map of Tulsa. And if I go back to this map, so here we have the Greenwood district in green, and here we have the Greenwood district in red. Right. So this red area here would be considered the Greenwood district or historical Greenwood district. This area in white is downtown Tulsa. So we begin to see part of the rationale for wanting to acquire Greenwood's land, right? So there was an idea to kind of develop Tulsa north. So today this is still North Tulsa. The historic Greenwood district is kind of still there. There's a resurgence that I'll talk about in a moment happening. But what interestingly occurred was that in the 1990s, Oklahoma State University, Tulsa acquired a majority of the land that is considered Greenwood today. Here is a picture of Interstate 244. And so Interstate 244, here in the front and then in the background, you have another portion of it, and this cuts straight through the Greenwood district. So a lot of this area right here is now covered in highway. right? So what you have now is a highway here. You have downtown Tulsa, you have the highway that, ultimately, accomplished that initial intention of capturing the land of Greenwood. And then just on the north side of the highway is where you have Oklahoma State University today. And so what you have is you have, again, here's the I-244, and here you are on the north. This image of this this church sign is on the north side of the highway. And so this is a wonderful image taken by a photographer colleague of mine, Jovan, who captures perfectly the circumstances faced by Black North Tulsans today. Utility assistance for North Tulsa, right? Again, here on the north side, another church, and its signage captures, the daily struggles of North Tulsans. The struggle is real, but so is God. This is off of Lewis Avenue. That's in the North Tulsa area. And so what we have here is, and I didn't mention it in the talk, but so the estimates are somewhere around at least 300 Black Tulsans were murdered as a result of the 2 days of the race massacre. The majority of whom are believed to have been buried in mass graves, unmarked mass graves in and around the city. And so there is this belief that, in this cemetery where this church group is standing, is a location of one of the mass graves. This is where the city, for the past, I want to say, 2 years plus, it was, the process was interrupted due to COVID, but it is, it began again, I think, just last year, just before summer. And so they've begun to find bodies, the remains of individuals on this area. Unfortunately, the understanding is that they won't be able to, accurately identify anybody, but the belief is that this is one of the locations where slain Tulsans were buried. So, here we have, following a couple of things. So I mentioned in 2017, the Race Massacre Commission was formed in North Tulsa to, produce a kind of resurgence around the narrative of Greenwood as this Black Wall Street. And so Greenwood gets the name of Black Wall Street. The story goes by a visit from Booker T. Washington, who, visits the Greenwood district and basically, remarking on the variety and diversity of commercial, resources and activities, just the kind of electricity of social life. He calls it a Negro Wall Street, right? And so the name believed to have been given to Greenwood relatively early, around 1915. So this is about 10 years or so after the founding of Greenwood, and several years prior to the race massacre. There's this idea of Greenwood as being, this commercial epicenter of Black American life. And so what you have is a lot of investment, partly through philanthropic organizations and through private capital, trying to, redevelop Greenwood on the basis of this narrative of this historical prosperity. And so what we have here, is, I think, a perfect image. You have the, and I took this picture. You have the highway in the background. That's the I-244. You have these two African-American businessmen, and you have this signage from the organization called Building Tulsa, which is a Black-run organization that are making a claim that Tulsa is the epicenter of Black wealth creation. And so what we see now happening is a lot of investment in areas like trying to make Tulsa into an economic hub, trying to make it into a tech hub, all around this historical narrative of Greenwood's prosperity. All right, and so this is my book, which will be out in October, that expands upon these arguments. And, effectively, it traces what I began with in today's talk, by further opening up the question of how this form of violence works as a means of development, and how it has produced in Tulsa, in North Tulsa specifically, the experience of underdevelopment that we typically would kind of assign to what we think of as a developing world, or narratives around a developing world, or what we would, in decades past call the third world. And so, with that, I will open up for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and sorry for jumping the gun before your pictures.
Oh yeah, sorry.
It was really nice to see that, and the blue dot worked very well. Does anybody want to start off with questions? Ben, you have your hand up.
Wow, thank you so much. There's just so much there, and my question is a bit fragmented, if it is a question, but I have definitely got at least one thing that's actually a question, and the rest is a kind of mixture of question and maybe comment, I don't know. So you mentioned about bombs being dropped from planes at one stage, and I wondered, this is definitely a question, like who was flying the planes and how much did it have to do with the state? So the second thing I wondered is about the relation between race and class in the whole story. Because if I got you right, there was a period prior to the massacre when Greenwood was relatively affluent, although not everybody was affluent. And in the kind of 50s and 60s, Greenwood had become characterized by poverty. Is that right? So there's a kind of downward class dynamics going on. And I was just wondering how this kind of connects with other things going on in the States, sometimes to do with class dynamics where mainly white workers are getting hammered, like in the West Virginia mine wars just around or before the massacre, and the state involved in that. And whether there's ever times when, even with white workers being convinced of the rightness of the wages of whiteness, that white workers come to see that their interest lies in fighting racism. Like David Rudiger, some sort of in class race and Marxism kind of holds out the possibility. I mean, I'm kind of seeing all this with Stuart Hall's, race is the modality through which classes lived, coming through my mind. So see what I mean? It's quite a rambling question / comment, but I wonder whether it kind of generates anything.
Yeah, it does. So just to begin with the bombs, so these are individual accounts, and so I don't make too strong an argument for the claim of there having been bombs per se dropped on Greenwood. So B.C. Franklin, one of the lawyers that helped to fight against the acquisition of Greenwood's land following the massacre, who was the father of the African American historian John Hope Franklin. He in his memoir, or in his notes, right, noted, that there were bombs being dropped. One could see, one could hear, etc. Bombs being dropped, on the city. And so we have a couple of examples like that, the accounts of Mary Parrish and other people who, are making this claim. And so the issue is that, and so when we're thinking about, well, who was dropping the bombs, if we believe that the bombs were dropped, we aren't thinking that the state was necessarily dropping bombs on Tulsa, right? What we can think of as being the position of the state was something actually a really complicated issue at the time. I gave accounts of how the state was in fact seemingly trying to do the right thing in a way, right? They didn't just go and try and string up Roland. They were trying to give some protections. They poorly managed the situation, and they also, we can assume, right, largely facilitated much of the destruction. And we can think about this in the kind of interpersonal ways that communities work with each other. So we can imagine a largely white police force, a largely white community, right? both of whom are effectively racist, right? It's 1920s, right? You have to, people were just racist, right? But racism was the norm, right? And so we can't think about racism, in our, in our kind of, 21st century context. So to think about racism as a normal framework. And so it isn't surprising that, the police force would say, okay, the problem, is the Black folks. Let's contain them and we'll be fine. And we saw that, right? We saw that, the police, failed to disperse the white mob, but they were very, effective in dispersing the small gathering of Black soldiers or former soldiers who, had arrived to help defend Roland. So we can understand that there was a form of racism that would seem to, however well intended, would effectively work to the disadvantage of the Black community. So when we talk about the bombs, I don't think we have to think about the role of the state in that moment as being so intentionally minded towards the utter destruction of Greenwood. What we are seeing is that the state effectively sponsored, citizen violence, right? The state supported citizen violence. And so if we're thinking about who dropped bombs, then we are likely thinking about, private white citizens who had their planes because Oklahoma was still, right, and it's today still an agricultural area despite the kind of oil industry. And so people would have had access to planes. People would have access to dynamite. These would be very common things in the landscape of Oklahoma at the time, especially because Tulsa is a very small city that is immediately surrounded by, vast swaths of rural areas and small towns. So we are talking about, private citizens likely being the ones who dropped, these bombs. The bigger issue is that, these postcards that I'm showing you, the newspapers that I reference, they disappear within weeks following the massacre, right? So people call it a cover-up, etc. But there is a lot of material. So the archival work around this is really difficult to do, right? You have to rely on people's, you have to really rely on secondary sources and some of this because the stuff disappears. And why does the stuff disappear? So Tulsa, Tulsa, while being formed, right, in the late 1800s, right, it doesn't actually discover oil until 1903, 1905, about 2 years prior to, a few years prior to statehood of Oklahoma statehood in 1907. So what happens is that Tulsa effectively becomes a boom town following the striking of oil. And so by 1921, we're talking about a city, in truth, that is only a couple of decades old, right? And that is only, a decade, removed from, one of the greatest, economic opportunities, known to the world, because Tulsa, right, not Texas, actually, is known as the oil capital of America and maybe even the world at the time. And so the last thing you want when you're trying to build industry and attract capital to your city is, a story of racial unrest and riots and murder and National Guards. It's bad for business, basically. And so what happens is all of the media material, right? All of the actual accounts of what happens over those 2 days disappear, right? Newspapers are pulled off the street, right? People, especially police officers, Scott Ellsworth, historian, a Tulsa historian, has a couple of books that really well details, because he goes and he talks to some of these police officers who, were alive at the time, over decades of research, and they have in their private collections some of these materials, but as far as them being publicly available, for decades they weren't. And so to my mind, that's really the, one of the biggest, crimes of the state is this cover up, and it's a cover up to facilitate, economic development in the city. And, so that's a bit of the kind of who around the bombs and the role of the state around the bombs, right? What we do know is that there's a reparations case that is being brought right now that was brought last year, that is making its way through its process, that directly implicates the state, right? The Tulsa Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, the National Guard, the mayor's office, the city council. So this suit is directly placing the blame at the feet of the state, or what we can understand as the kind of agents of the state. And it's not really because the state, they're not claiming that the state enacted this violence, but the state facilitated the violence, right? And so that's the formal view about what the role of the state was in this entire process. So the issue of race and of race and class, it is an important one. So in the book, I talk more about the complications of class formation in Tulsa, right? So I'm somewhat critical of the kind of nomenclature around Black Wall Street, Negro Wall Street, etc. Because in fact, when we're talking about Black Wall Street, we're talking about Greenwood Avenue, right? We aren't talking about blocks and blocks of neighborhoods of affluence. We're talking about a very active, main street, basically what we would think of as a main street in, or a high street, right? And in the immediate, let's say, streets or blocks emanating outward from Greenwood Avenue, you did have a hub, right, of affluent Black Tulsans, right? These are the families of some of the earlier entrepreneurs. I mentioned J.B. Stratford. I mentioned O.W. Gurley, who had their hotels, the Stratford Hotel, the Gurley Hotel. People like A.J. Smitherman, who was a newspaperman, right? So what we have to do in thinking about Greenwood is actually think more intentionally, which is what I do in the book, about the formation of all Black towns in Oklahoma. So prior to statehood in 1907, what is the area of Tulsa? That half of what we can think of now as the state of Oklahoma, meaning the eastern side of Oklahoma, is what was Indian Territory, right? This is where Andrew Jackson effectively removed southeastern Native peoples too, right? As part of what we can think of as a Trail of Tears, right? And so without going into too much of the history, Black life shows up in Indian Territory as a result of the Trail of Tears, because there were Black members of many of these native groups, native tribes, right? But importantly, following the failure of Reconstruction, right? African Americans start migrating from the South, to Tulsa or to Indian Territory, let me be precise, to Indian Territory, right, in the 1880s. Some of those African Americans, right, in what we can call the Exoduster period, had moved to Kansas prior to that, just immediately following the failure of Reconstruction. So in the late 1870s, Black people had gone to Kansas, and some of them had developed certain kind of economic, activities, access to capital, and it's some of them who actually show up in Greenwood specifically about a decade or so later. Who show up in Indian Territory about a decade or so later in the 1880s to help create these all Black towns. And so what you have is Greenwood really following the model of the all Black town that exists throughout Indian Territory. And so because Indian Territory is not, wholly under the jurisdiction, right, of the federal government prior to its incorporation into the state of Oklahoma in 1907, there is what we can think of as the kind of geographies of freedom made possible for formerly enslaved persons, right? There, while there was racism, right, there was no what we think of as a formal code of racism. Jim Crow, it does not operate as a formal system in Indian Territory. And so what you have is this foundational ability to actually gain resources, right, to form political autonomy, to create, what we can think of as, free Black life. And what I argue in the book is a form of African-American sovereignty. And I make that claim sharply in the book because we don't really think of sovereignty as being a part of the African-American narrative. We're happy to think about Black sovereignty in the Caribbean and other, former post-colonial, other, former colonized spaces. But we don't think about that terminology in the case of Black life in America. So Greenwood basically is a district that operates like an all Black town. And so, as a result, what you have are some people who show up, who literally found the district, who have capital, right? They attract other people with capital, right? Who have capital. There's a significant amount of boosterism that happens. And I talk about how some of these newspapers, work to attract people to these all Black towns in Indian Territory and then to Greenwood later. Now, what happens is that if if you're a poor African-American, say you're still in, Alabama or wherever you are, you're still in Mississippi, and that there's a place where Black people are doing well in this place called Tulsa, you're going to want to go there. And so what you have, right, is from the founding of Greenwood in 1906, over the following decade, you have, scores of African Americans who just flock to Greenwood. So they're poor when they arrive in Greenwood, and they mostly remain poor, right? And so you do have this really important class distinction of what we can think of as the kind of early founders of Greenwood, those early capitalists who are able to capitalize, on their early investments in Greenwood, and then the secondary wave of migrants who come to Greenwood seeking opportunity, as many migrants do, right, under normal circumstances. And so what you have is actually outside of this, let's call it the bubble of Greenwood Avenue, you have devastatingly poor areas of Greenwood, right, in North Tulsa, a little bit further out. And so you have a significant class distinction. What you also have is an interesting interracial relationship between the moneyed class in Greenwood and whites. Right. So what we know is that there are records of lending to poorer whites, as from African-American debt holders. We understand that there is, in fact, a lot of interracial commercial activity. And so I think what you see is you see that the history of Greenwood, the history of Tulsa, on racial terms, is actually quite it is quite murky, because we can't think of it because of the on normative terms of Jim Crow segregationist racism, right? I mentioned NDB Connolly, right? He talks about how in South Florida, right, in South Florida as being part of the New South, right, that emerges after these kind of Jim Crow formations, right, that emerges outside of the plantation landscape of the South. How, in fact, the development of South Florida, specifically the city of Miami, required interracial cooperation amongst capitalists, right? And so you see the same activity in the history of Tulsa's development. Now, what you can think of is that the kind of working class or working poor whites in Tulsa would have, right, some kind of resentment. You can think about the kind of holding of antipathy, right, of resentment for this idea of just the sheer notion that there are affluent Blacks. Because just like poor Blacks came to Tulsa or came to Greenwood seeking opportunity, poor whites also continue to migrate to Tulsa to take part in the broader oil industry. What is important, however, is that African Americans weren't actually allowed to participate directly in the oil industry in Tulsa. So many of them were part of what I call the kind of secondary market around the oil activity. So basically, most Black Tulsans, if they weren't entrepreneurs in Greenwood, they were a part of the larger service economy that were servicing, companies and industries related to the oil industry directly. So they would be, like Dick Rowland was a shoe shine in downtown Tulsa, right? You had many people involved in domestic service. You had, this kind of, I wouldn't call it casual labor, but you had, this labor that, again, was secondary to the oil industry. Now, what you talk about in the 1950s and 60s, is something very similar. So what happens in the immediate post-war period, or sorry, during the war period, right? The kind of war industries develop, and African Americans are beginning to benefit from it almost in the same way that they benefited previously to the rise of the oil industry, right? There is some direct opportunity, right, in some manufacturing plants and that kind of thing, but it's about the kind of capital that is brought to the city as a result of the rise of the war industries that produced I guess as what we can think of as a general circuit of opportunity. What happens is that in the post-war period, as those industries begin to disintegrate, right, what you see is a return to the kind of normal codes of racism that bar African Americans from the commercial industries that are born out of the transformation of some of these war, these kind of war-focused companies, right? And so what you see is, again, a circumstance where employment is difficult. The problem is that this time around, what you have are the introduction of the Highway Act in 1956, right? That actively seeks to, acquire land and condemn land for the building of the highway. And, unsurprisingly, Greenwood is chosen as a location. And then what you have is the, in the 1960s, the integration. And so I'm by no means trying to argue against the value and importance of integration, but what I'm trying to make a claim around is the fact that segregation actually protected the capital of Black neighborhoods, right? So what you saw, what you see are accounts of the circulation of money in Greenwood, where the claims like you could write your dollar, you could write a name on a dollar, your name on a dollar in Greenwood, and you'd see it before the end of the day, right? Or there are claims that capital, a dollar would change hands 18 to 21 times in a day in Greenwood during the period of segregation. What happens is with integration, you have what people like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor call predatory inclusion. You have, this ability to now go shop and spend your money elsewhere. You also have, the ability of individuals to go move elsewhere. And so with this, you have, with Black flight, with predatory inclusion, right? With these kind of, problematic processes of incorporation, of inclusion, what you have is the depreciation and the increasing instability of Black capital in Greenwood or in the African-American community. So these three things come together, right? Integration, the highway, right? And the kind of increase in unemployment due to, racist prohibitions in labor in the post-war period that lead to what we can think of as the kind of what I would argue is really the second assault on Greenwood following the 1921 massacre. It's a very long answer. I apologize.
No, that was an amazing answer. Thank you. And did you want to follow up at all?
Sorry, I was muted. I was just saying that was just excellent. It was an absolutely amazing answer. I learned so much, took a lot of notes, and now all I need to do is order the book.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your question.
Any questions from anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Ben. Other Ben.
There's too many Bens. Thank you so much for that talk. That was amazing. And I think really shocking, obviously in parts, but so insightful and really helpful to kind of see the massacre situated in that longer kind of historical trajectory, and the way the different forms of violence kind of thread together. I think was just really, really insightful and helpful for me to see anyway. And I really like the way that you've kind of attached it to sort of ideas around underdevelopment or anti-development, de-development, that there's kind of, active processes of underdevelopment going on. I think that's really kind of fascinating to see that playing out as well. I also quite liked the kind of the acknowledgement about the kind of financial actors involved in this, insurance companies and their role within these processes from my own kind of interest in how financial actors play in healthcare. I think it was interesting to see the kinds of processes that they were involved in as part of this broader movement, part of the broader systems of violence. I wondered, I guess there were two things which don't really relate to any of the things I just said, I guess, but two things that occurred to me during sort of as you were talking and in the discussion so far afterwards. One is about federal involvement or not, as it kind of sounds like that this was very much sort of state, Oklahoma state, and less federal. But maybe I've interpreted that wrong, and maybe they kind of, I don't know whether the federal government did intervene or not, to what extent it intervened. And the other one, I guess, was around, which is just when you were showing the pictures afterwards and showed the pictures of the church and the two churches. And I wondered about the extent to which churches and religion had, whether that had, to what extent they evolved as part of, these processes, or were involved as part of the process, part of the recovery process, to what extent. Also, I guess in the first case of the massacre, to what extent they were targeted as well. So, how their involvement within this process, I think, would be great to hear more about.
Yeah, so these are two really, really critical questions. the second one in particular, I kind of talk about too much in the book. So I'm really happy to, because of this, how central the church is. So the federal involvement, it's the state who's responsible for getting the federal government involved here, in the United States, and there was no request. There were lots of considerations for getting the federal government involved. The extent of involvement was the requested presence of so actually, it was the Oklahoma National Guard that shows up. So we're not even thinking about the federal National Guard, right? So you have really what is a state-contained event, and it makes sense. And this is why it was really important for for venues like the New York Times to show up and begin writing, on the event in the days after, because otherwise, we don't really know what we would have known more broadly about the activities of the 2 days. So. Yeah, that's and we begin to, it's interesting because we begin to see, or maybe we can draw a connection to the kind of states' rights, philosophy of Republican states, which Oklahoma is securely a Republican state, a conservative, highly conservative state, in this way. And so, the idea of federal involvement was I think largely disregarded, right? This was something that needed to be contained to the city, not even to the state level, right? This is something that needed to be contained in Tulsa. So the role of religion, the churches, Poor Mount Zion Church, they had just finished building their church in April of 1921, and a month later it was completely demolished. It took that church 30 years to literally rebuild the physical church. It took them 30 years to finally rebuild that church, which happened in the 1950s. And Vernon AME Church was largely destroyed as well. There was and also a need to rebuild, but what we know is that the church, as a part of the kind of social fabric of the community, was integral to the rebuilding. What's interesting, and this is what I talk too much about in the book, is that so what happens is that by the 1980s there is a in America, generally, we think about the war on drugs, the war on crime, etc. Right? So Tulsa, Tulsa is part, North Tulsa, the black community of Tulsa is recognized and designated as one of these hotspot areas. And so Tulsa Police Department does a kind of 5-year analysis of what the issues of around crime are in this part of town. And they're doing, what we can think of as basically like broken windows, policing, like trying to understand, well, what are the social, inputs into this crime. So we're not looking at crime as just, what we might think of as, moments of criminal activity, but as part of this generalized, social and geographic, set of circumstances from which crime is a result. And so, interestingly, the Tulsa Police Department puts out a report in 1988 that I discussed in the book that recommends an increase in social services, right? Like, well, the problem with North Tulsa crime is they, one, interestingly identified the highway as one of the biggest problems. They say the highway has cut through the neighborhood, it creates, spots for people to do, drugs and to sell drugs, and, it is a problem. So the response is, we need to increase social services, but not social services from the state, but social services from nonprofit, what they call self-help groups, right? So what's happening is that Oklahoma City in the early 1980s, you have this emergence of the kind of nonprofit sector and groups that help to actually facilitate and generate the development of the nonprofit industry. So by 1986, 1988, when the Tulsa Police Department is making this recommendation, right, they're thinking about the role of this emerging industry of nonprofits. And so when I arrived in Tulsa for my fieldwork in 2014, all I see are nonprofits. everything that the neighborhoods require are being provided by nonprofits. Healthcare, education, not transportation, but we are thinking of food access is largely being provided by nonprofits. There's a mobile grocery store that drives around selling food because, actual grocery stores like the national chain, Albertsons, like a Sainsbury's or what have you, has left the city, or has left the neighborhood. And so then what I learned is that these nonprofits work very closely with the local churches in North Tulsa. And so what you have is, and I call it a matrix in a talk, what you have is actually this deep collaboration between nonprofits and churches in providing these services, to poor North Tulsans. And so, the problem is that, of course, we know the kind of impacts of NGOs and nonprofits, is that, they are largely precarious, organizations. They depend on their ability to attract external funding. They depend on their abilities to successfully gain grants from the state. And so, again, the services that they provide are not necessarily, guaranteed. They fall away, they close, all manner of things happen. So what I argue in the book is that the church is actually helping to facilitate the ongoing function and success of these nonprofits. For example, I show up to a church back to school giveaway in the summer of 2014. And there's all kinds of stuff. It's a wonderful, assortment of backpacks and trainers and school supplies and food and books. And my job, I'm there, as an ethnographer, I'm there and I'm given a job on the day. And my job is to take the names of the people who are showing up to receive goods. So I'm asked to get names, address, telephone numbers, and the number of children in the household. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Why does a church want to know how many people are in the household? Aren't they just supposed to be, Christian charity is giving stuff away, right? Like, why do we even need a registry? So I'm assuming throughout the entire day that, they might want to try and, grow their congregation or something like that. At the end of the day, 4 people like rush me. And they're like, so what's your email address? Can you email me, a photocopy of that list? I'm like, wait, what's happening? Who are you? And there are people from like these 4 nonprofits who provided all of the materials for the back to school giveaway, right? And so what you see is that, what they wanted basically lead lists. They wanted possible, customer lists basically to help, to whom they could then, from whom they could solicit, their services. One was like an education thing, one was a food thing. It was this kind of mixed bag of nonprofits that helped to facilitate the day. And so the role of the church, to my mind, is one, in a structural way, is one of still facilitating the kinds of developmental ambitions that we see some of the bigger churches immediately following the race massacre doing, right? So Mount Zion, helps to coordinate, rehabilitation, right? The redevelopment of Tulsa. Vernon AME does the very same thing. But what we have is redevelopment, which we can think of as the process of underdevelopment effectively. The churches are still today trying to help North Tulsans, but they're helping them through the kind of philanthropic, industry, which I argue effectively undermines the spirit of what was happening in Greenwood and what was happening immediately post-massacre. What I will also say, and I talk about this in the book, is that the landscape of churches is really fascinating in North Tulsa and Tulsa generally. It is a very religious place. People kept telling me we're the buckle on the Bible Belt, right? And it's true. Everything is organized around the church, right? In certain places, like in Oklahoma City and certain affluent neighborhoods just outside of Tulsa, you have these mega churches with, thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of congregants who are part of these churches. But you have on one end that kind of church, and then you have, people like, there was one woman who said that she ran the church of me, myself, and I, right? So you have what I would call the walking pastors and the walking reverends in Tulsa who, are getting involved in whatever way they can. And so, so religion is the order of the day in Tulsa, which is why it was really difficult to write about it in the book, because I couldn't just write a chapter about religion, right? Like it isn't like you would have to think about religion, as being any one of the kind of, ongoing and necessary, mechanisms of the development of social life, but also economic and material life in Tulsa. So in other words, one doesn't just leave church, right? One, church is a part of everything, or the notion of church. And so what you have is a complete industry of nonprofits, but also a complete industry of churches in North Tulsa. Right. And so this undermines, again, the spirit of community and building in Greenwood, because before, what you would have were just a couple of really, what we might consider cornerstone churches, right? Metropolitan Baptist, Vernon AME, Mount Zion. And these churches were cornerstones of the community. But now you have dozens of churches, right? What you have are North Tulsans shopping for churches. So they aren't able to develop deep roots of community in a particular church, or in the congregation of a particular church. And so the kind of networks of support that we believe churches normally do provide, they aren't really providing them, because there are way too many. There's way too much choice. And so people are like, oh, well, I don't like what the pastor said this week. Let me go and try this new church next week. And so you have that. All the while, the kind of congregations of these cornerstone churches, which are still there, they remain either much older or they remain much more affluent. So the congregation at Vernon AME, had decreased significantly, where they were down to just 100 parishioners. But you have somewhere like Metropolitan AME, who's so the philosopher Cornel West, his grandfather was once the pastor of Metropolitan Baptist, and they are a largely Black middle class church. So these are people who would have moved out of North Tulsa but still come to North Tulsa for this historic church. And so again, they don't participate, right, in the ongoing economy of North Tulsa, in the ongoing relations of community in North Tulsa, because they have moved elsewhere, but they just come every Sunday to come to church, and they go back to where they live in South Tulsa or out in West Tulsa.
Thank you so much. That was a really comprehensive response. Thank you. I can see how you ended up writing way too much.
It's fascinating. And so like the healthcare thing that you're working on, like the healthcare issue in Tulsa is everything is run by nonprofits. And so what does it mean where, your healthcare can be available to you one day and not the next, right? What you have are people who are forming churches so that they can actually run, nonprofits out of the church, right? You have these really fascinating relationships and arrangements that are ongoing, that use the church, as a primary tool to facilitate what we can think of as nonprofit development in the city. And then those nonprofits, one last thing, these nonprofits, especially the larger ones, they all have their roots in the oil industry in Tulsa, right? So what you have are these people who are trying to somehow, solve for the problem of poverty that their founding companies effectively caused, due to racist policies starting a century before.
So Jen, do I have quite time for a quick follow-up of where we're going to end? Thank you. So really, it was just to pick up on something that came up as you were responding, which was really around actually within kind of churches within the white neighborhoods. I'm thinking particularly now around the kind of time of the massacre, to what extent people did or didn't attempt to reconcile what was going on within Greenwood versus their kind of religious sentiments around kind of presumably Christian sentiments around kind of appropriate behaviors. I just wonder, is there an attempt to try and justify it in religious kind of sentiment or not? Is it just sort of buried?
Right. So I think it's important to think about, so who were the rioters, right? And this goes back to Ben's question earlier, which was about, well, what are the kind of class dynamics here, right? So we have to think of the majority of the white rioters, as being largely working class and poor whites, right, in Tulsa. And so what you have in South Tulsa, right? So you have North Tulsa, you have the kind of, let's call it the empty zone for right now of downtown Tulsa. And then below that, and then growing, further south is Southern Tulsa, which the majority of what we might think of as a middle class, white residents, and this is where they live, right? And so you have a thing where, in North Tulsa, you don't have any grocery stores, right? People are shopping at like Poundland or what have you, literally for their groceries. And then, on the south side of town, which because of the highway you can access if you have a car in 15 minutes. You have multiple Whole Foods markets, you have, you have everything. You have these perfectly manicured lawns, So what I would say is that, all of the accounts, and these are the claims that we have available to us, is that most of these white people who we would think of as the kind of middle class white Christians, right, in South Tulsa would claim ignorance to what happened on the day, right? So the idea is, well, oh, wow, how has this happened, right? In many ways, these are the communities that the cover-up are trying to, prevent from having full knowledge of what occurred on the day, right? So again, this is not a state assault, right? This is not, it is not that kind of thing. Now, I think, with the formation of the kind of initial, and I can't remember the name of it right now. I mentioned the phrase earlier, but the first committee that was formed following the race massacre, right, before the mayor rebranded it the Reconstruction Committee, right? We should assume that what they were trying to do was to exercise these Christian values, right, of charity and so forth, right? We see Christian charity as being largely the thing that facilitates the creation and the growth of these nonprofits, right? They are inherently Christian, these nonprofits, right? They may not be overtly Christian, right? They may be secular in form and presentation, but they are driven by these Christian ethics of charity. The same goes for the big philanthropies, although, one of the biggest philanthropies in Tulsa, the George Kaiser Family Foundation, they are a family of Oklahoma Jews, but they're still driven by what I was able to determine was still this kind of religious notion of charity, right? Even in the Jewish faith. So it is a part of that. And I think, when we're thinking about racism though, right, we understand that there is still a great deal of racist paternalism that was baked into what we can think of as Christian notions of goodwill. And so it is still all those poor people over there in Tulsa. We should give to them, but we shouldn't actually build them up, to be self-sufficient. We shouldn't actually build them up to compete with us in the actual secular terms or domains of our lives and business, etc. So I think that's the best way to kind of think about, how that worked. Absolutely, I think it is important for us to think about, organizations like the Salvation Army and so forth that had a role in Greenwood, both prior and after the race massacre. So you still had white organizations that were still trying to, go and evaluate and find resources for some of the poor, sectors of the Greenwood district, of Greenwood. And that continued afterwards, right? And so today, in other words, my view is that today, white Christians in Tulsa are really no different than they might have been, during the 1920s, with the exception of this acceptability of overt racist, beliefs, right? Sorry, they may still have these beliefs, but without the overt racist, articulations, right, of what might be racist beliefs. So today you still have that at play. In other words, you kind of get the sense that things really haven't changed that much. And so that's why I rely on this notion of repertoire, this notion of againness that Deborah Thomas offers, right? Because it's important for us to say, well, things really don't change. And so what we have to do is we have to disabuse ourselves of an attraction to the spectacular, right? Let's think about the mundanity of violence as it shows up in possible bombs being dropped and gunfire and so forth, to a nonprofit showing up and undermining a community's ability to develop self-determination. And underneath it all, right, is a Christian sensibility that we have to kind of reconcile. Imperialism, Western imperialism was a Christian project, right? We can't forget that. My son, a year ago when he was 6, asked me on Columbus Day, Dad, why was Christopher Columbus so jealous? Right? And I said, what do you mean, son? He's like, well, he came here and saw all of the stuff that the people here had and he wanted to take it, And, this notion of jealousy is antithetical to the Christian belief. Yeah, we know that Columbus was a Christian. So, it's about these contradictions that still are reconciled through, a pursuit of acquisition and accumulation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I might jump in with a question if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Something that really struck me, you said early on in your talk, was that the inability to maintain self-defense amongst the Black population, especially when you were talking about that in terms of, I guess, collective self-defense, this idea that people were coming together to protect that main street and that kind of stronghold collectively. And it just really struck me, well, like very depressingly in terms of like Kyle Rittenhouse and recent events where the idea of self-defense is being so kind of staunchly defended by white Americans, but also when you kind of are talking in a more expanded discussion about, I don't know, there's something about the kind of dissolution of the ability to concentrate people and activity in one place, like there being something very special and evocative about how you describe that original kind of access to public life in this area, and then whether that's kind of the proliferation of different churches or the instability of capital, or all of these different ways in which that kind of keeps on being eroded through kind of a relentless reconfiguration of violence. But I don't know, I think I was just wondering from your field work if that kind of sense of how dispersed the space felt or something. I don't know if that is a feeling that you have, and especially with the highway and that kind of sense of it being the place, I guess the place enfolding all of these kind of violences that are financial and all of these other violences that you've spoken about. But I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but something about how it feels to be there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about that in the book early on. I show up in North Tulsa in 2014, and so what I'll say quickly is I show up in Tulsa in 2014 because I finished my PhD at LSE, and then I'm hired on a research postdoc, at LSE, studying cooperation and inequality, and multiple sites are selected across the world, and I end up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a result. So I go to Tulsa really without any expectation, and I've partly grown up in America. I understand Black communities in America from that experience, and so I show up, in Tulsa expecting more of what I'm familiar with already, and I get none of it. Right? There was like no visible public life, when I show up, and I'm like, well, maybe it's the summer because it is certainly damn hot, but maybe that's why people aren't around. And then I start talking to people, and they say, well, no, you only see people at 2 events, church or a football game. I said, okay, that's different. Greenwood Avenue, right, with the highway over it, and the image at the front of my book is a guy standing underneath the highway on Greenwood Avenue. So you see Greenwood Avenue is just, it's empty. Greenwood Avenue is now, or was then, primarily a conduit onto the campus of OSU Tulsa, right? There are a couple of shops, that kind of thing, but it really isn't anything. So you don't get that sense of social life. You don't have that understanding of community as made visible, right? When I lived in London while I was at LSE, I lived on Holloway Road, right around Emirates Stadium, and you're constantly inundated with people. Whether or not they see themselves as a community is irrelevant in a way, but the sheer sense of life in a place, right? Whether it's a place as dense as London or even somewhere like here in Berkeley, which is a very small town, you still have a sense of the community based upon who you see, what kinds of exchanges are occurring. And I saw very little of that. I would go as far as to say I saw none of it. And I was surprised as well, because I arrived in Tulsa in August of 2014, just a couple of days after Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, right? And there were lots of Black cities across the country here in the US that were rioting and that were protesting and doing all manner of things, right? And nothing was happening in Tulsa, right? There were no demonstrations, there were no protests, right? Nothing was happening. And, so there was none of it. The idea with the resurgence of Greenwood following, the kind of, past couple of years, right, where more attention has been brought to Tulsa in this particular history that I talked about today, is they are trying to revitalize the Greenwood Avenue. They are trying to recreate through commercial opportunity a kind of activity, on that street. But what I'm seeing is that it's largely commercial activity and not necessarily, I haven't, it's too early to see or to have any kind of definitive view, but it's about, well, let's create businesses, right? Let's just have lots of businesses. But there isn't the same kind of comprehensive, diversity of shops and leisure spaces and these kinds of things that actually do make up what we think of as a main street. So we'll see what happens. What I will say is that I was in Tulsa for the 1921 centenary events. So last year I was there during the kind of May 30 to June 2 period. And it was buzzing. People had come from all over the country. It was fantastic. And I write about that experience in the book. And I say, well, this might have been, right, like what Greenwood felt like, right? People, talking, celebrating, eating, what have you. Unfortunately, and I also talk about this in the book, that I followed up with people, because I wanted to know what happened months later. So I followed up with people in September. I just texted them, I didn't show back up in Tulsa. I had teaching to do, what have you. And they're like, yeah, it's dead. Like nothing is happening. You know what I mean? It feels like one of my contacts here said like, yeah, it kind of feels like 2016. You know what I mean? And you're like, oh wow. So, so I don't know, what there are ongoing investments in the area, and I hope that leads to some, greater sense of activity and a sense of place rooted in this kind of activity and vibrance, but we'll see.
Thank you. That's really, it's really fascinating. And it must have been a really fascinating piece of fieldwork, because it sounds like it's generated a lot of really. Yeah,
it was tough. It was 7 years. I've been basically going back and forth to Tulsa for 7 years, and, which was very different from writing a project based upon 2 years of field work, which is what I did for my Jamaica book. And I was in Jamaica and I was just there, and so so much had changed over those 7 years. When I got to Tulsa in 2014, nobody was talking about the race riot. It wasn't a topic of interest. When I went back in 2016, nobody was talking about the race riot. It wasn't a topic of interest. 17, some things were kind of like emerging on the ground, and okay, but that's something. But what really happened was, I think, the release of the HBO program, The Watchmen, in 2019, which centered on the Tulsa Race Massacre and used Tulsa basically as a backdrop for this superhero drama. And I think that helped to bring some renewed public attention to the history. And then what happened was that George Floyd was murdered, basically on the 99th anniversary weekend of the Tulsa Race Massacre, or roughly around those days, just the days prior. And so I think the media basically began to make, some connection, whether it was justified or not. I personally stayed out of the fray of trying to, make something of it. But between 2019, the release of this TV program, and then with the kind of racial reckoning, as it's called, emerging out of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, a year later, Tulsa became this new phenomenon. And so I go from having to make sense of this place as being wholly overlooked, right? And, with this fascinating history. In fact, for the first few years of my fieldwork, the only interesting thing about Tulsa, when I would tell people about the project, was that I, as a Jamaican, had somehow decided to go and study Tulsa. People only wanted to know why was I doing it. To several years later, where it's become this whole phenomenon. So I don't know how well I've done, but the book is hoping to try and express and contain and really make sense of these transitions as they occurred over this century-long period, but really over these past several years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was wondering, just as you were saying that, how people in Tulsa were making sense of that renewed attention, or how that reflected in everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, so what you had, really were, beginning with, there were organizations, there were people in Tulsa who had always been trying to fight for this history, right? There were organizers who had always been trying to advocate on behalf of those individuals who were thrown into unmarked graves a century ago, right? In the year in the late 90s to early to about 2000, 2001, there was a commission to study the Tulsa race riot, right? They recommended reparations back then, 20 years prior, right? They recommended reparations. They never went anywhere. So there's always been this ongoing thing, but it's fascinating because it always was like folded back into a kind of normative narrative around development, right? And it became what we think of as a kind of politics of reconciliation instead of reparation, instead of recompense, right? And so the issue is that what happened is that quite early, as part of this resurgence and even facilitating some of the resurgence, was the role of some of these organizations that are like nonprofits organizations and so forth, and development organizations that had effectively worked really hard to capture and to hold on and to shape the narrative around Black Wall Street. And so today there was what we saw during the centenary was a tension between what we can think of as some of these more grassroots organizations and some of these, these more recent investors in the narrative of Greenwood. The problem is that, it is these most recent investors in the narrative of Greenwood who are able to attract the majority of the money, right? So they built this brand new kind of history center called Greenwood Rising, that sits literally, catty corner across the street from the Greenwood Cultural Center that has effectively done the same thing for decades, right? And they represent, these two poles of organizers, right, around the history of Greenwood. So I think what we see, like with the Build Tulsa sign that I showed you in that window, right? Tulsa is the epicenter of Black wealth. What you have is effectively a capitalist narrative that's really driving the resurgence of Greenwood. And so what I do worry about is the everyday quality of Greenwood that won't be able to follow, follow in step with this development, because it isn't really being brought into the conversation in an organic way.
Yeah, so quite like a capitalist version of it.
That's exactly it is it's representation, it is marketing, it is this kind of thing, and but we'll see what that does, right? I mean, because the argument can be made, at least it's something more than what was being done before. So we'll see what it does, and I hope to go back. So one of the photographers that I worked with, I mentioned him, Jovan, who took the pictures of the churches. So he and I are planning a longer term project in Tulsa to try and actually chart what actually does happen. So I'm still committed to to the place, to the people, and so we'll see what occurs over the next year or so.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Ben, I don't know if you have any other questions. I feel like we've been.
Yeah, no, thank you for your time. It's been great.
Did you want to ask anything else, Ben?
No, that's me done. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure it's supper time over there now, isn't it? Yeah, might be. No, you both are quite young. You eat late, I'm sure. But yeah, but thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Tell Paul, you know, I hope he feels well, and you know, to just drop me a line sometime if you want to catch up.
Oh, I'm sure he would love that. He was really disappointed to miss you today. Thank you so much. And
all right, sure. Cheers. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.